Hello. Welcome to another podcast from Care at Scale. My name is Greg Greeners, and I have the awesome pleasure of welcoming my guest today, Brittany Carswell. She is the owner and founder of Wellness Psychological Services. And in this episode, we have the opportunity to walk through Brittany's story. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Well, from the first moment we were able to connect, it has been just an interesting ride in the sense of how much your story and your life has brought about where you are today. The more that we talk and the more conversations we have, I'm very much intrigued to have more and more conversations with you. And I have to compliment you for the background that you gave, because it really helps me understand where your story is, where it all stemmed from, and more importantly, where your passion today is really driving to help others in this industry. I thank you for that as well. With that, I will ask you to start at the beginning. And I didn't know until I read what you sent through to me, but it really did start in the beginning when you were a kid, because there might have been a tie back to your parents and what you're currently doing now.
Yeah. So both of my parents were psychologists. So I guess you could say psychology was possibly in my blood, literally and figuratively. And I did work in my mom's private practice in the summers when I was in college. So I definitely got kind of, well versed in that world, but I was anything but thinking I was going to go into it. I was absolutely going to do something, totally different. And so it's kind of funny that it just kind of kept pulling me back. Even when I decided to major in it, it was kind of like, well, I don't really know what else to do. And I was going to go to law school or do something else. And little by little, I just kind of just kept getting pulled back towards psychology. And I think ultimately it's just who I am. My wiring is I just have this deep, almost obsessive desire to just understand people and myself and the world and why we do what we do. And so I've just always been kind of fascinated by it. And it's driven me in a lot of different directions from here. And, it's funny that you say interesting story, because I was thinking just before we started it that in some ways I don't know that this story is that unique, in the sense that I think a lot of mental health professionals, certainly not all, but many, can probably relate to having this desire to understand yourself better or things in your life, right? That leads you down that path. So, that part of it is maybe not, as unique, but then how my unique brain and wiring took me into that journey is kind of where we may go with this.
Well, and that part of it, when you're learning and not realizing you're learning, when you're listening in your house, when you're listening to your parents talk about these things, you don't want to listen to whatever they're talking about, but it's somehow filling your back part of your brain where you weren't going to put anything anyway, I guess. But you were hearing these discussions, and as you were going through your formal schooling, I think that was one of the real trigger points where you're like, no, I want to dig in a little deeper with what's happening here. And not only for my own self-understanding, but then about others.
Yeah. Yes. And so I found myself just kind of going down that path toward grad school. And I honestly don't remember how early, but once I was in grad school, I was in a psychology program, which is usually not, most psychology programs, PhD programs, are not couples or family oriented typically. So I always had that as a big focus. I've always been very, again, fascinated by relationships, not just what each person does, but what happens when we put two humans together, right? And all kinds of interesting things occur, right? When you have the interplay between two different people and all the things that go into them and their history. And I've always been an extrovert, very relationship and connection focused. My friends, my relationship were kind of my world. And so I sought out couples training, and they had an LMFT program, a different program at the school. So I'd go over to their program and kind of do additional stuff over there to try and kind of get my foot into that world as well. And so I've always kind of had half of my clinical world in individual therapy and understanding kind of anxiety, high functioning anxiety. That's sort of and perfectionism and imposter syndrome and a lot of things that kind of go together in that world. And then also relationships and couples. And so those are kind of the two passions that that I've had kind of guiding me into this journey that I sort of just kind of at some point, I don't really know I don't remember where my trajectory went from law school to grad school in psychology, but at some point it just changed.
Well,
And
the part that you end up having to seek to work through the couples portion of therapy, as opposed to just, individual, was a precursor to many things that are happening now. Though during that education process, it really helped you also identify some of your own things that you were going through, which you just kind of rambled off a list of them. But perfectionism, making sure you're constantly on, these are traits that you had that now you're witnessing how it's going to impact more than one as opposed to individually this
yeah.
couple.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So having always sort of been in this kind of high achieving, what I came later to sort of view as high functioning anxiety, which isn't really like a diagnosis per se, but kind of a manifestation of how people compensate
Hmm.
with their anxiety, experiencing that as an individual. And then somehow I was also getting referrals for people that were like very similar. So I ended up sort of niching into this world of high achievers, helping a lot of physicians, attorneys, healthcare providers, other therapists, and sort of like finding that whole world, both individually with individuals as well as couples, where we might have, two of those kinds of individuals in a couple, which creates its own set of obviously dynamics. And meanwhile, I've been with my husband since I was in my first year of grad school. So we're at almost 20 years together, like growing up together, basically. I was pretty young when we first got together and trying to sort through my own relationship, having children along the way, which was an incredibly, as we were talking about earlier, eye-opening experience. So I'm figuring out all these things about myself and about like doing all these different trainings, trying to kind of make sense of everything. And then you go and have kids, right? And it just like blows everything up
They do.
in a great way.
It's
And
an
also
awesome way.
like just makes you look at your life yourself. I just realized so many different things about myself, my own wiring, having kind of kids that you just seeing their temperaments from so early on and got me down a rabbit hole, which is what I do basically. I just go down these kind of research rabbit holes and do a million different trainings on things. And I'll be in this phase of like trying to consolidate all this information and make sense of it and understanding how temperament and some of those biological pieces combine with attachment and trauma and history and all these other things. And we don't have a perfect model for making sense of all of that, right? Like, was this in my blood literally? Was this how I was raised? What combination of nature, nurture, So that's a fascinating kind of piece that's always just something I kind of come back to,
Hmm.
trying to understand it, but not just understand it. I think that's where I know for myself, I can even get lost, and a lot of clients can too, who are highly analytical. We want to understand, 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 and we can spend so much time there. And insight does not necessarily mean change. And so how do we both take learning and understanding and use that as a framework to then help people figure out what is getting in the way of actually making the changes that they might be hoping to make, and what are all the skills and the neuroscience behind all of that that helps people actually make the shifts that they're looking to make. So me trying to make sense of all that and then put it into like frameworks that make sense to other people is sort of like where this has taken me kind of over time. But yeah, I think it all just kind of comes from this just very almost hyper focus
Well,
on
speaking of hyper focus,
understanding.
you were diagnosed well after a young age that you would think of in the 8, 9, 10 years old, where ADHD is really got to treat this. You were a young woman at this point that they recognized that this is something
Yeah,
that you have.
I was the classic. I mean, and it's a humbling story because it was so far out of my frame of possibility. That was just not how my identity was. I have anxiety. And why does my anxiety never really seem to fit? And that's, it's more high functioning anxiety. I've compensated in these other ways, and I do have, I've always dealt with anxiety on some level, but there was this entire missing piece. And so that really came by surprise and had me really kind of like looking at and understanding things. So that was probably the final piece that really helped me make sense of a lot of pieces. And obviously I think a lot of people are talking now about sort of the impact of perimenopause on women, but especially women who are ADHD or who were late diagnosed ADHD, that is the time where we start to see it, because when those hormonal shifts happen, the things you've been doing to compensate and mask all of your life start to become harder. And so, yes, that was very much kind of what was happening for me. And that, this is my hyper focus. And because I was so able to be high achieving and successful in that arena, there was just no way that I could possibly be ADHD. But yeah, there was a lot of pieces that I wasn't factoring into that picture.
And now you've got this piece, and in the back of your mind, you're doing traditional therapy, couples therapy, and trained to do it. I will call textbook, your traditional treatments. And you now have this diagnosis that is an aha moment of like, oh, okay. And you're in the back of your mind, you're constantly trying to tie together more so than what's being put out in front of you in our community of acceptable healthcare to some extent. You're like, no, there's more to this. So now you've identified your own biology in this sense, and you know your temperament. But now we're rolling in the nervous system and all of the other things that you have started, because I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves of where we're going, but you're now living this personally, and at the same time, you're practicing clinically for couples therapy. There's dots starting to be formed, not put together yet, but they're starting to be formed.
And it's interesting. I don't think I even wrote about this, but I was doing a mastermind at one point. I had this, I wanted to make a course. I wanted to put this into some form. And so it became what started as just like, I want to do this thing, then turned into, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, I got to do it right. And what do I actually believe? And how do I answer these questions? And how do I put that into a structure? And it was like a 4 to 5 year long process for me of like almost deconstructing, taking all these different trainings that I had gone to that were saying kind of similar-ish things, but using different lingo, strategies, tools. And along the way of doing that, I found this mentor. Her name is Julianne Taylor Shore, and she like uses kind of neuroscience, neurobiology, understanding kind of the brain and how we're like our nervous system and brain wiring drive all of these things. So if you look at all these different modalities, like they're all kind of trying to do similar things in different ways. And so I was very interested in like, okay, what's the underpinning like thing that brings these together, and what then are the skills we're trying to kind of teach people, whether I'm in individual therapy or couples therapy. And so I just dug into that. And this was happening even before the ADHD diagnosis, trying to understand kind of how our nervous systems and brain wiring influence our reactivity, how we self-protect. I could spend hours on that, but to kind of sum it up, the neurobiology of all of that, which is happening kind of beneath the surface. So then when you make more and more sense of your own kind of like temperament wiring through various different like descriptions where you're like, oh, I finally kind of get myself in a different way. And oh, what's it like to understand? So my husband's been diagnosed ADHD since forever ago, right? And like that wasn't me, that was him. And so, understanding even that interplay and how like that's a diagnostic label, but what actually did that mean for both of our nervous systems being more easily sensitive and reactive to triggers and stressors, and why we may struggle with certain things more so. And then how our kids who have some of that similar genetic wiring and whatnot, and just living how complicated it is, how hard it is. And so that's kind of what really all those pieces coming together just had me like trying to make sense of it. And then even doing the thing that is hard, which is, okay, let's make sense of it. Let's put it into a program. But now you actually have to practice it. You have to actually do it.
So let's stop on that part for a second, because you did start your practice and it was yourself, and then you were trying to refer whoever was coming in that might need some more additional support, and the clients didn't necessarily get support that they needed. So you said, well, I probably can help with this, and you started hiring people, and you kept hiring.
Yeah, so then it's still a huge part of my life, if not the bigger part that feels like kind of like my prior life, but it's still very much like my day-to-day is I have a group practice. And so where it initially began was me as a solo practitioner being full, having people reaching out to me, and coincidentally having a provider who reached out who was looking to kind of work with someone and get supervised. And it kind of started there. And this was not my plan. That one sort of like just grew out of, okay, there are these clients. I'm trying to help find them resources, help find them good people, help train good providers. And so it began there with, access issues, which is still something, even as the practice grows, that obviously we're seeing, right, is people having a hard time accessing quality care and then being able to access care where, their insurance may cover it. So we have kind of a, multi-specialty practice with a lot of different providers. It's across many, many years, it's grown to about 18, 19 different providers with different areas of specialization. Some are virtual only, some are in person and virtual, and trying to find fill those different holes so that people could actually specialize. The providers could specialize in what they're good at or best at, ideally. And then I think people too tend to just do better work when they're doing what is more their passion and what they're kind of highly specialized in. So slowly building different areas of specialization so that when someone calls, we can do our best to find them that right resource, either in the practice or if not, try to, offer some referral options outside of there. And many of the providers do accept insurance, not every single one, but most of them. We have at least one or two providers that accept, trying to kind of again, broaden that access to care, because not everyone, therapy can be out of pocket, can be incredibly expensive. And, I see like both sides of that struggle. As providers, we want to, people want to make money and they have to live off of what they're being paid. And also there are many clients who are not in a position where they can self-pay. And so how are we having like a wide array of access to different resources depending where you're at in your journey and in your ability, to access care, to have resources to access care. And so that became very much kind of like a passion for me to want to not leave anybody hanging if we could
Well,
avoid
and
it.
not only did you not leave him hanging, but again, I'm with Brittany Carswell with Wellness Psychological Services here on this podcast. And you decided one location wasn't enough. You got two locations, and the virtual in today's environment, to have multiple choices and certainly to have multiple services available within the therapeutics is wonderful. Referring is so challenging in this marketplace without knowing exactly what you're referring to when you're controlling that piece of it, especially when it's tied so close to you, is a great opportunity for certainly
Totally.
the people you're serving and the people who are working with you too, because you trust your colleagues, right?
Yes.
And to some extent, irons sharpen irons. You're helping each other through this process. And I want to touch on that for just 1 second, because you put in one of your documents you passed along to me that you find it very important to have a successful practice is to have your people who are giving the therapy and participating also healthy. And that culture isn't necessarily the norm within, well, it's just not within people who provide therapy. They get burnt out very quickly
Yes.
because of being part of their daily existence. It can be heavy.
Yes, I really, really, especially, kind of part of where I've specialized over time, especially working with so many people in healthcare and so many physicians, is burnout, right? And burnout ends up being sort of the far end downside of high functioning anxiety in a lot of cases. And so, both the people I see clinically as well as the people that I work with, my own experience of that, like, let's practice what we preach here, and we are our own instrument. And if we are not taking good care of ourselves and we are not, having the boundaries of what is an appropriate load, which is very different for each individual, we're not going to do our job as well. And so, my philosophy has been pretty simple. And look, I will say some right time, right place. As the pandemic came, we were able to expand virtually, and that allowed the practice to expand in ways that I had never imagined prior to that. And so there was, some luck in how that probably grew and expanded. But also, if someone were to ask me, I would say, like, my philosophy is like, do really good work, like word of mouth, do really good work, provide excellent service. Customer service in general, and also like equally take care of the people that work for you, the people that are providing that service, so that they are giving a good service and that they want to continue kind of being a part of the team. And so that has kind of been my philosophy, and it has made people generally, I think, want to stay on, just feeling kind of cared about and valued, and that at the end of the day, the number one thing is like providers' well-being. You cannot do this job well if you are not healthy yourself.
It's like the jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron. If you can't practice what you're trying to do for others, you end up in the same
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
Kudos
Totally.
to you for recognizing that and then practicing that both physically and actively for the people who you work with, because I'm sure they appreciate it because it happens. It
Yeah.
happens. It happens very quickly.
Try.
I want to get back to how you've got this practice now that is covering the spectrum of therapies as best it can within
Mhm.
reality of what it is, because there's still many more out there than even you have in there. But
Yeah.
you're
I
you're
mean, if
walking.
there's any child psychologists out there that are looking, we need more of them. We have like one right now, and there's so much demand for that. For example, there's so much demand we can't even meet in a large practice.
No, oh, it's there's a demand. It's for sure. So you continued doing your couples therapy as the primary piece of what you were doing. But as you're learning more about these couples that you're providing therapy for, this is where back to putting the clinical side and then wait, there's more to this. And maybe it's more nervous system based. Maybe there's something more that I can actually spend the time and energy that, oh, wait, I just know now what I have to put it into something that would be very helpful for others that when they're not participating with me for therapeutic sessions.
Yes. So, I've trained in all the major kind of couples therapies, Gottman, EFT, PACT, our relational life therapy. So I have all that training, and then I kind of got into the neurobiology and the neuroscience, and some of them touch on that in little bits, but that was kind of the through thread for me. And I felt like it unlocked again as I'm going through learning these things about myself, like all of it just finally unlocks for me. Like as an individual, where have you felt stuck, right? And that was the final piece that really unlocked it for me personally. So I was like, okay, I think there's something to this. So that combined with couples therapy is a challenging practice, right? You're dealing with two people. Many therapists would say it's more complicated than individual therapy. You're dealing with two people in the room, and I love it. It's my passion, but it can be intense, right? There's a lot happening, and so it's a very different dynamic than individual therapy, and a lot can happen. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot. And if you don't really have a way to ground what's occurring, in my experience, then you can just get caught in what a lot of couples experience, which is feeling like they just came in talking about the issue of the week and going in circles kind of, and that isn't necessarily productive. And so, there's many modalities that have different ways of approaching this. But for me, I felt like, how can I break this down into what are the skills that we're trying to teach people? And part of that is understanding kind of the nervous system basis is one of those skills. And there's about like 10 that I've put into my program. And so I structure my work where it's a combination, at least if I'm in therapy with someone, of like, we're working through it, but we're also grounding ourselves in skills and a shared sort of like language and knowledge, and hey, this is what we're all working on and working toward. Are we in agreement of that? And so instead of just bouncing from thing to thing, I found that like it already we're trying not to do that clinically, of course, but it provided for me a way to ground the process that I found to be like significantly helpful for me clinically, and most people responded to pretty well. And it varies. I have some people who will dig into that very concrete educational thing, and it is super helpful, and some who probably are ignoring 90% of that in like educational reading things and looking at things way, but are still kind of buying into the process, at least in the structure of the process. So like the way I approach it, or the skills I've created, sort of allows for that flexibility. If you have two people, how do we help both of you kind of ground in a way that works for your nervous system? So that was what I was doing clinically. And eventually I translated it into an actual like program that I was kind of giving to my clients so that they could have one thing I don't think we talk enough in the world of therapy about, or really do something about, is both prevention and what I call maintenance. And maintenance is like, now we're done with therapy. How do we actually maintain this growth? And so I was like, I want something people can go back to, and not like they need to come back. That, of course, that's fine. But I want them to also feel like they have resources that they can come back to maintain the growth, because
Hmm.
old patterns pull people in so much, right? It's so easy to do lots of work and 6 months later get pulled right back into your old stuff. So it was like lots of different parts of me wanting to do many different things and create a thing that could be given to people to keep, as which it became an online course that they can do during their time with me when we're in therapy outside of our work together, something they can have afterward. And then ultimately, like, really my passion for it, which we touched on, I think earlier, is like as a way to create access preventatively for people that maybe are not ready or don't need to go to therapy just yet. That's when we really want to intervene, is earlier, whether we're talking like premarital type of therapy or just early in a relationship. Like, there is so much more room for easier growth at that point.
Well, I
So
was going to quote something you gave to me, which was, we don't believe someone should wait until they develop heart disease before learning about exercise, nutrition, and their blood pressure. I don't think we should have to wait until a relationship is in crisis before learning how to take care of it.
yeah. I
And
think the Gottman's research is that couples wait on average 6 years longer than they should have, or 6 years into problems before they seek help, And so, I mean, I could get on a soapbox here. I mean, I wish we were teaching children relational skills, right? Because when I talk about relational skills, we're talking about couples here a lot. But the thing I'm actually most excited about is I'm turning that couples program into just a relational skills program, whether it's your relationship with your mom, your relationship with your child, your relationship with a friend, or your partner. A lot of these skills are very, very similar, especially on a nervous system level. The same kinds of things are driving issues and patterns. So these are just relationship skills. They're just like being a healthy human connection skills that I mean, we're teaching our kids, geometry and algebra, but we're not always giving them as much time overtly in understanding these other things.
And one of the other things you said was just helping understand that nervous system, because a lot of times it's not on the forefront of any of what, which is why it's so intriguing that you've connected so many of the pieces from your childhood through your formal education, through your practice, through all of that clinical experience. If you were better understanding I'll call them trigger points, but the events that happen, then it doesn't have to become a crisis in the first place.
Yeah. Well, the more we lay the foundation for like having skills on the front end, right? Build the skills, the earlier we do, great. But also, we're also building out the like, hey, we're all human. And just because we have skills doesn't mean we aren't still going to have struggles or have stuff that like we are having a hard time making a shift on for various different reasons. And can we then, as part of the skills, knowing when to like seek out help if you're inclined and able to do that as well, and not feeling like that's a failure either.
Well, people can and have and will continue to seek your help out. And one of the tools that they now have access to is what we've been talking about, which is your relational wellness roadmap. And this is something that can supplement, it can be primary. I'll let you explain it, but you have now taken what we've been discussing here for the last 30 minutes. That is something that people can now utilize at any time as opposed to when they're in front of you.
Yes. So, I've been waitlisted for couples therapy, and most of the time I am. And so that's not something that's always accessible, but for people that do like a structured approach, it's something that they can, and so actually let me back up the thing I was mentioning earlier. So I've kind of broken what are all the skills we need to be more healthy relationally into a program. And it's kind of like each skill kind of builds on the one before. And so that's what the relational wellness roadmap is. It's you know, written resources, it's videos, it's got a lot of stuff in it. And you can kind of pick and choose. I've even designed it where there's longer videos and then there's a summary video because we all have different learning styles. And I have some people that like 5 minutes of explanation is all they need. They do not need to get into the weeds. They are not a me. Like I am the person watching the 20-minute video and, soaking up every detail. And I have clients who that is extremely helpful to them. And oftentimes their partner could not care less about the 20-minute video. It doesn't mean they care any less about their relationship with their partner. That's just not how they process. And so I've kind of broken it into like different, like you can take this information in various different levels, like literally like quick 1-page summary, few page summary, longer reading. I have it broken down at that levels to help to just validate the reality that like I think structure is helpful to most people, even some people who fight it, but that does not mean that we all have to be the person who needs to dig into these skills like at that level of depth, because it's really more about, am I actually going to practice these skills? What amount of information? So the course itself is the education. And then the hard part is how do we actually translate that education into now each one of these skills involves practices you can do and things you can do. And how do you actually translate that into practice and repetition, which is where change actually happens. And so sometimes people come to therapy because they're not doing that on their own easily. But I think there's a lot of us out there that are like craving it, ready for it, just need some guidance and education and a clear enough path, because it's so confusing. Relationships are so complex, all the different layers. And so I try to make it as concrete, make something that is so not concrete as possible, while also acknowledging that like this is nuanced and nothing is black and white or simplistic, but let's make it as concrete as we can to help ground us in something to come back to. Because, when you're just in the heat of a intense argument with your spouse, like that's all that's going to happen in that moment. You are emotionally flooded, and if you don't have something very, very clear cut that you've practiced to kind of be able to know nothing good is going to happen in this state, I need to take a timeout, right?
Well, the fact that you thought outside the box, but it really was never outside the box, because everything that you've been working towards and for your entire professional, I was going to say even younger, is culminating to something now that continues to grow in ways that I can't wait to see, because you're just I don't want to say in the infancy, but you're just in the beginning phases of how online and technology, and we'll get into that hopefully in another podcast we do, because it will be equally interesting and important. But you're doing these pieces that have just come from your inner being to bring out and try and help others. And you can tell that it will for sure. So I said this to you before we even clicked the button. It goes fast, and we did it. It flew right by, and here we are. I would like to do another conversation, if not 2 or 3 or 4, because we have plenty to discuss. More importantly, plenty for others to hear that you're doing. And if they come into your practice and have therapy with you, and then an amazing online opportunity to continue to work through these things. So with that being said, is there anything that you might want to mention before we wrap up?
I think you kind of mentioned it, so I'll just like reiterate like the prevention piece. I think we all I think most people would agree, right? It's easy to say that, and we talk about it in theory, right? Like how do we become a less reactive culture, and how do we actually start to think about and really practice prevention? And even on an individual level with our own children or whatever else, like what are we kind of imbuing in how we are learning and what we're giving our attention and energy to. So just kind of coming back to that idea of really thinking about prevention, and also and I think this is what you were alluding to for another conversation around I started getting these programs out into the world just as AI was also kind of like coming into the scene, and just the boom of information that has created for everyone. And so much of that between social media creating access that we didn't have before, and then AI, it's all really, really cool and exciting. And we have so much access, and at least for me, I know like information overload. And so it's very easy to just get inundated in information and education and not go for depth, right? Watch a 30-second video that oversimplifies something, and then watch another one and keep repeatedly kind of looking. And people are using social media, I think, to like learn even really important stuff, mental health stuff, right? There's some good stuff out there, but 30-second clips or 60-second social media videos are like really oversimplifying the reality of how hard a lot of these things are to tackle and change. And how do we like utilize these tools, utilize social media and AI and technology to help educate, to help with prevention without and losing or sacrificing like depth, nuance, context, and like the reality of having more information does not mean change becomes easier necessarily. Like it's hopefully creates, and that's what I try to do, a platform that makes change clearer and the path to it clearer. But we actually still have to take a lot of steps and practice things repeatedly. It's like the thing no one really wants to hear, right?
Yeah. You're absolutely correct, and that is the AI and technology side of it is almost perfect to the soundbite to create that. Not all 30 to 60-second sound bites are what you need to hear, and hopefully that is exactly what someone will hear on a clip or something, because that they'll recognize the fact that there's more than just listening to that 30 to 60-second clip. And it's true, especially with everything we just talked about here today. So, Brittany, so glad you joined me. I hope that we can have more conversation about so much more that you're doing. And I really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. I feel like your mission is really in line with kind of this thing I've been wrestling with, right? Like, how do we help make things more accessible to people, right? And genuinely get help to more people and information to more people. So I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm excited to chat more with you in the future.
Well, we'll do it again. And until then, I thank you, and we will talk to you again soon.
Sounds great.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye-bye.